Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Organisational Transformation Corporate Delivery Committee. For your information, we are going to start recording and live streaming now. Okay, thank you. Any apologies for absence?
Yes, Chair. I have apologies from Councillor Hannah Lawson and Leslie Walton.
Any disclosures of personal or prejudicial interests? None to note.
Yes, Chair.
Patience?
Yes, employee of Future Generations Commissioner. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any other disclosures? No. To approve the minutes as from Tuesday 24th of January, page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4. Any matters arising? Can we have someone to move the minutes, please? Patience, and then we'll have second. Thank you. Item 4 is co-production. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Susie Richards.
Susie Richards. Susie's here today to present co-production to us, so I'll pass to you, Susie. Thank you.
Lovely. There we go, lovely. Okay, so this report will update the committee on the Council's co-production and involvement project and seek your involvement in the development of a corporate co-production policy. It'll recommend that the committee considers the development of a corporate co-production policy in relation to member, officer and citizen need, integration with other emerging regional and national policies and those of our partner organisations, and the identification of co-production stakeholders and how we can best reach out to individuals from seldom heard from groups. So the paper itself moves through an introduction to co-production, background to the project itself to date, the current position of the project, and then takes you through to 5 areas for consideration, which you may wish to discuss today moving forward. So point 1 looks at the background to what co-production is, and there's a diagram there of the spectrum of involvement, and you can see there that co-production and involvement is right there at the right hand side of that spectrum. All of those areas are equally valid and suit different circumstance as a way of engaging with our citizens, service users and the public. In terms of the background of this project, the Council's been looking to increase our capacity with co-production for several years now, and actually adopted the Regional Partnerships Board Regional Co-production Strategic Framework in July 2021. We've been looking to build on this strength and looking to incorporate co-production formally within our 2022-2023 corporate plan. And against that background, with funding from the Economic Recovery Fund, the Council procured external support from the Co-Production Lab Wales to work with the Council over a 12-month period in order to build our capacity and gain from that expertise, which we recognise isn't currently in-house, but so that we can build on expertise gained through the pandemic and further build on our capability capacity moving forward. So the project began back in October 2022 with the first phase focusing on assessing the Council's existing co-production capability and our experience there. So we're almost to the end of that learning phase now. We've engaged with members of the council and our officers through the use of a survey, through engagement directly with staff and leadership, and by collecting examples of good practice. In addition, we've actually engaged almost 40 co-production champions from across a whole range of services in every directorate, and initial engagements taken place with the council's senior leadership. We've also delivered initial training for a number of those champions. So the current position moving forward is that learning phase is almost over. The key element which has come out of that is the need for a corporate co-production and involvement strategy to provide a framework for that area, for that improvement moving forward. So the project itself will now lead to the development of that draft corporate policy, and that will identify when and how we use co-production. It'll identify how elected members and officers can all determine the most effective ways to co-produce projects to make sure that we engage with the widest diversity of people with an interest in whatever matter is involved at that time in relation to that project. So the policy is going to help us embed a culture of co-production across the organisation, rather than perhaps where we've traditionally used co-production in the social services areas. It'll also be supported by a range of practical tools and resources, which we'll be developing now, building on this good practice in the next phase of the project. And that will include a toolkit of resources, the development of the web page, which will host those tools and resources. We'll be looking at really zeroing in, developing a role description for the co-production champions and beefing up that virtual champions network, and looking at training for our co-production champions to make sure that we've got relevant co-production experience throughout all of our services. So over the coming months, it's very exciting. We've got CoPro Lab, who are going to provide advice and support on live projects and issues, which are yet to be identified, which we feel would benefit the most from a co-productive approach. So the areas which the insight and experience of elected members may best be used to inform the policy, which you may wish to consider, around five key areas, and that's looking at maybe where co-production is and where it isn't an appropriate interactive activity, and the difference between co-production and involvement, and that spectrum of engagement and involvement activity. You may wish to consider the biggest barriers to co-production and how they can be overcome. A key question is how co-production complements representative democracies, and specifically at Swansea Council. The identification of Swansea Council's co-production stakeholders, initial work's been carried out. You'll see in Annex 2 there's a stakeholder map, which gives you an indication of the organisations which we've identified to date. If you'd like to consider how we can build on that, and also importantly reach out to individuals from seldom heard from groups, that would be fantastic. And finally, if you could consider potentially links with the Regional Partnership Board's co-production framework and charter signed by Swansea Council. So I'll hand over to Mike Corcoran from Co-Production Lab Wales, and he can add his comments and guide you through that discussion. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Susie. Welcome, Mike.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome. Hi, I'll pass the floor over to you, okay? Thank you.
Can I ask you a couple of questions first, please, Chair?
Yes, Joe?
Yeah, could you just explain what the difference is between partners and stakeholders? She started off by saying they've engaged partners and stakeholders. So what's the difference between the partner and the stakeholder?
I guess a partner is a subset of our stakeholders, but because of the hands-on and quite critical involvement in development and implementation of a policy, we'd highlighted our partner organisations as being of particular relevance for consideration.
Thanks.
Jo, is there anything else?
Not at the moment, but
Okay.
I'm sure there will be.
Okay, thank you, Jo. Over to you then, Mike. Thank you.
Diolch, thank you very much, and good to be joining you all today. I'll keep my remarks relatively brief here, knowing that the most important thing is that there is much time as possible for conversation and to you to ask any questions of me. So I'm here today representing CoProLab Wales and my colleagues who are supporting the council with this project, as Susie's just outlined. And really just to build on what's already been said, in terms of what co-production is, in the spirit of how we're talking about it here, it's in one sense something we can think of as synonymous with involvement in the language of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and one of the practical tools and mechanisms through which the involvement principle can be meaningfully enacted. In a broader sense, however, we can think of co-production as a culture moving from doing things to and for people to doing things with people. And the primary motivation for that co-production exercise is really to acknowledge the inherent value of every person, to ensure that every person's voice is heard, and to make sure that every person can make a meaningful difference to the outcomes in their own lives. In terms of why we should co-produce, it's again about acknowledging that value. It's about bringing a fight against social injustice, making sure that all people have equal opportunities to control the outcomes in their lives, no matter who they are, where they were born, what luck or lack of luck life offers them. And more than that, it's about ensuring that where we operate in complexity, as we all do in delivering public services, we can make sure that where no amount of technical expertise alone can guide the way forward, where we need to innovate and experiment and compromise and understand the very nuanced interrelations between multitude activities that impact upon thousands or tens of thousands of people. And the only way to meaningfully move forward is to share power, share responsibility, make decisions together, learn as we go. And co-production is the way out of complexity and the way forward to navigate through complexity. In terms of how one then does it, again, there's no silver bullet, there's no simple answer. Co-production is as much a journey as it is a destination, and it is as much a culture and way of thinking as it is a checklist or toolkit of technical practices. It's about finding the right solutions for the right people in the right places at the right time. It's about having suitably flexible structures that can allow us to understand what any given community needs to move forward with a given challenge, and understanding that through the technical practices of creating safe spaces, creating ways of facilitating different kinds of conversation, through ways of generating and harvesting learning in real time and moving forward in small and incremental steps, we can start to achieve things which are not possible in any other way. I appreciate their quite general and abstract comments, and I hope that as our conversation and questions begin, we can look to some more discrete and specific examples. I can see some hands are up already, so Chair, I will stop speaking there and allow people to come in with any questions or comments they may have.
Thank you, Mike. Right, we'll have Councillor Hale. Jo, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. I've read a couple of quite high-level reports on co-production sponsored from central government, and they really highlight that the true benefit and the real benefit in co-production is financial, as in saving money and efficiencies for local authorities. I'm just wondering, what areas do you believe efficiencies could be made in co-production, and bearing in mind that co-production there should be a balanced approach. So it should never be all about the money, although some of the reports I've read do indicate that the real benefit is only a financial benefit.
Thank you, Councillor Hale. My personal opinion is that the real benefit will never be only financial if co-production is done right, because I think there is always a benefit to the citizen of having their value acknowledged and in being given the opportunity to control their own outcomes and their own direction in their life, no matter how small or how profound that may be. I do agree, though, that co-production is part of, and again, using the language of the Wellbeing Act and the 5 ways of working, a move towards a preventative model. And in terms of long-term efficiency savings, working co-productively to identify sustainable preventative solutions in service design, and slowly but surely moving away from short-term reactive solutions, will bring significant efficiency and by proxy financial savings. Another way in which co-production can lead to a financial return is by building engagement with and participation in services to get the most potential, the optimal potential out of any service, because people feel some sense of shared ownership of that service because they had some meaningful way of informing the development and delivery of that service. And if our services are being used optimally, they are more efficient, and if they're more efficient, it brings a cost saving. So I completely agree that there's a financial benefit to co-production, and that might be our primary incentive, being candid. But I never think it's exclusively financial personally, because I see how people feel when they're ignored and left out, and how people feel when they're involved. And I think there's an inherent value to involvement. That's my personal opinion anyway.
But we haven't, sorry, Chair, but we haven't brought your company here to save 2 bob, have we? We brought your company here to enable the council to create efficiencies and save quite a lot of money. So I'm just wondering, do you have a figure on how much money your project will make us more efficient by? Have you given us a guarantee?
We haven't. At the point of awarding of contract and throughout, we haven't talked about this project in terms of a pound for pound return on investment. I believe it will deliver one. I believe that would be a long-term return, not a short-term return. That has not been part of our discussions with Swansea Council to date. It would not be a trivial thing to calculate, because the direction in which the project unfolds will determine the nature of co-production which is delivered, the services it relates to, and again, I don't think there would be a meaningful way for us right now to make a sensible estimate of what that return would be. But as you said, that the broad national and international literature suggests that a move towards co-production in the right places is a move towards a preventative model, which will in time deliver a financial return. But we haven't made those estimations with the council today.
And through the chair, can I ask that members of this committee follow your work and be invited to some of your events as well? Thanks.
That would be fantastic.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Councillor. Susie, you indicated to come in.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to thank Councillor Hale for taking that approach. Generally, the criticism and the argument with co-production is that co-production is a different way of working. It's a very intensive way of working. It's a slower, more time consuming, more considered way of working that does take resource. This particular project isn't about looking at more resource. It's about doing what we do differently to get the best possible return. And you're absolutely correct. What all the studies show is that co-production is cost effective, not because it's cheap to do or it's an easy thing to do, but because it ensures that by co-producing a project, you end up with an end product which is needed, which is wanted, which works first time, which has had the kinks worked out of it, that is meaningful and meets the needs of service users. And that's why in a time of increasing cost of living, as a council, we can't afford to not look at co-production options wherever it's appropriate, simply because we have to make sure that things land right first time, that we don't go down rabbit holes or look at putting services forward which perhaps don't meet people's needs as well as they possibly could. So that's the key reason that we've invested in this project. It's actually a real breath of fresh air for it to be suggested that that the council is entering into co-production in order to save money. I'm actually delighted to have that charge because it really recognises the value of co-production. But I certainly wouldn't want to insinuate that co-production is a cheap option or an easy option or something which won't require reconfiguration or the re-orientation of staff culture and working practices. So absolutely. On that basis, because what we're looking at is using co-production more because it is effective, that's the primary consideration. It saves money, brilliant, nobody's going to turn that down in the current climate, but it's because it works. That's the primary consideration, and that's our primary way of evaluating the performance of this project, is what outcomes do we get? What's the difference in terms of staff's ability to support our citizens through co-production process wherever it's appropriate and relevant? And what's the difference in our citizens' ability, and across the diversity of all our communities, what's the difference in their ability to feed in, to influence and make council services better?
Thank you, Susie. Any more? Oh, Patience, sorry, I missed you. Councillor Bento, sorry.
Thank you, Chair, that's okay. I was just looking at the report, and obviously when it comes to diversity, there is this reference to seldomly heard groups, and I've just scrolled down and looked at the list of partners, and it's quite a vast range, you know, of diverse organizations on the list. Very diverse, I would say. And again, we do know that, you know, by saying that there are, or acknowledging that there are seldomly heard groups, means that there is a challenge, and which is one of the things that we should be considering today. However, my question is, very often we hear this, you know, about diversity and groups that are not very often heard from when it comes to co-production. Do we have an idea of why this is so? Is it because we're not reaching out to these groups, or is there a barrier that's stopping these groups from responding when it comes to co-production?
Thank you. I won't for a moment pretend to have all of the answers, because these are the big challenging questions which all councils, all organisations are wrestling with and debating right now, and if there was an easy answer we would know it. I completely agree that this is one of the most important things about our exercise, and any exercise. Co-production is about empowering the disempowered, ensuring all voices are heard, and that means we have to consciously identify and break down those barriers which can prevent people from participating in co-production and in democracy more broadly. Something which somebody said to me, or somebody said at an event I was at very recently, which really struck a chord with me and certainly helped the development of my thinking, is nobody is hard to reach, but some people can be easier to ignore, and it's on us in our organisations and in our professional capacity to work out if there are things we are inadvertently, through our structures, through our cultures, through the prejudices we all carry in our roles, making it harder for some people to engage with us than others. In terms of how we overcome that through a co-production exercise, a few of the things which will be critical are to be humble, to accept our vulnerability, to accept our ignorance, to accept that we don't know everything, and to go into spaces carrying that vulnerability and humility that we will need help, we will need to ask questions, we will need to accept that we may be making mistakes in order that we can learn and grow and develop relationships, earn trust, build those relationships with communities person by person, one at a time, slowly but surely. We will need to work in partnership. We will need to work with those organisations and those groups who know their communities best, who understand their needs, who have the trust and respect of those communities, and who we can work with in partnership as a bridge to allow us to develop our relationships. And we will need to accept that this takes time. We can't develop these relationships overnight. And if we look for a quick solution, we won't find it. We have to be in it for the long term to make sure that we can break down barriers which may be generational barriers to participation. I think we also have to accept that we need a degree of flexibility and creativity in our approaches. There is no silver bullet in engagement and co-production. If we look for any one perfect way to engage everybody, for every person it suits, there will be somebody whom it doesn't suit. And so what we will need to do is make sure there are always multiple ways for people to participate and engage with us, but each of those ways provides equity of experience, equity of involvement. And so that flexibility and that creativity and that humility, alongside working in partnership, going to where people congregate, where they feel safe, where they feel at home on their terms, rather than expecting people to always come to us in our places and in our terms, will be critical. They're the common threads I've seen through any project I've ever been involved with or inspired by. But I don't pretend it's simple, I don't pretend it's easy, and I certainly wouldn't pretend I have all the answers.
Thank you, Mike. Susie, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'd absolutely echo everything Mike said there. And just to reiterate that we are at the start of this sort of co-production journey at Swansea. We're very conscious, and we set out explicitly in the methodology of this project that we do consider that wider diversity to make sure that excluded groups, that people who are perhaps underrepresented, to make sure that we are able to reach out to those groups. And the way that one of the ways that we're doing that is by concentrating our efforts internally across council services, rather than focusing on a particular outreach group. We're looking across the council to make sure that the level of expertise in every service is increased by a network of champions, and to be able to make sure that our council workers, who often do build up trust within a lot of communities, which are seldom heard from, for want of a better term, that they're able to use that that confidence and the tools which will be available to them in the future, and the network which will sit behind that, that they're able to use that to co-produce and support every community in co-producing, rather than focusing on a group which we do co-production with. This will enable us to co-produce on all sorts of projects, all sorts of areas across the council, rather than having a central sort of co-production area, which sometimes can end up excluding people. So it'll make us much more flexible, much more able to respond to the needs of our communities, and that means everyone in our communities going forward.
Thank you, Susie. Patience, Councillor Boot, is that legacy hand?
No, it's not. It's a new hand. It was just to add, you know, appreciate the response that I've had, which is very encouraging, but also to just add that with my background in equalities, and being a councillor in what is considered the most racially diverse ward in Swansea, I'm very happy to support in any way possible, and you can reach out if there's anything I can do. I'm happy to help in any way.
Wonderful.
Just thought I'd put
Thank you, Councillor Benson. That's very kind.
Thank you, Patience. I've got a question about champions as to the selection and how we've got to where we are today with the champions, and really as to how we grow and develop and get an end. So champions first, and when we talk about diversity, it comes in all different shapes and forms, and I keep saying it, during the pandemic there were so many that stood up, who were part of this organisation, who were not part of this organisation or part of any third-party organisation, who kept the city on its feet. And there was a lot of good practice, things that could be brought into this project. And there's been a lot of tick box exercises which have been positive. So firstly about the champions, and secondly, yes, we are out there in the communities as elected members. We know which way our community works. We know the positives, the negatives. We know probably a touch on what's needed there regarding co-production. And when you reach out, to diverse groups, or when you reach out to all groups, I think it's going to be very interesting as to what our findings will be, because people haven't got a voice, because they haven't got the confidence or the knowledge to come forward. And, that might be through any experience in life. We're not talking about just an element of young people. We're talking of generations here. And there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of skill across the city. And, I hear what Joe says. We would like to be very much a part of this. I hear what Patience says as well. We would very much like to be a part of this because we are a part of it. And I want to thank you and Mike for coming here today and opening up this conversation. We've got a long, long way to go, but we've started, and I think we've waited on this committee more than any committee probably, for an open door point regarding co-production. So just about the champions, please, and thank you, Susie.
Okay, so the first phase of the project focused on learning. So at that point, the champions were self-selected, which is why it's particularly gratifying that they've come from across all directorates of the organisation. But it is very much a first stage. The champions were involved in putting together the survey, which has helped CoPro Network start to evaluate where we are and what it is that we need as a council to move forward. The next phase will look at refining the role of co-production champions, what exactly is needed, because we haven't assumed to understand that right at the start. So we'll be using the learning, which will be which will be collated into an insight report by the end of next month, beginning of April. That learning will help us to develop the role and how exactly the champion network will operate and how it will support services, and also it will review how champions have been engaged and look at their training needs. We're not looking at a one-size-fits-all approach. The idea is that we take people and we look at where their gaps are, where their knowledge needs building. Some people will have quite a good understanding of engagement methodologies and co-production. Other people really will be coming in at the ground floor. So it's about getting a solid core, a platform that we can build on and change the culture of the whole organisation. So going forward, once we've got that, the role really and the outputs which we're looking for with those organisations, working with leadership, working through managers, and to make sure that it reflects their needs as well, then that will help us have the most effective support that we can then put in place. It's about getting our own house in order before we go out to the communities. We can't hold people up if we're not tooled up ourselves, and we recognise that, you know, we've got a way to go with that, as every council in Wales does at the moment. So yeah.
So how many do we have currently? Sorry.
I believe it's 37.
Thank you, Susie. Any more questions? Any observations?
Yeah, can I ask? Yeah.
Joe, yeah?
Yeah, what actually do the champions do?
At this stage, the champions have been involved in the research learning project, which is identifying where we are as a council at the moment. Looking at what skills are needed, what gaps there are, who we are engaging with, who we aren't engaging with, the stakeholder mapping process. So at the moment, it's a very light touch, and it's as little or as much as people want to do going forward. The next phase, where they'll be involved in developing this sort of more formal championship spec, that's where we really nail down exactly what you're talking about and identify what the existing skills are out there and what we need to skill up in order to take everyone, you know, to the position where we have an expert, if you like, you know, deep in within every service. That's the ambition here.
But are they volunteers or are these paid officers?
Oh no, these are volunteers at the moment. What we've found in the past in lots of different areas is where we've attached a paid officer, and I'd certainly say this, having worked in a sustainable development unit, which did fantastic things, really promoted the cause of sustainable development, but as sustainable development is now part of our corporate plan, it's part of the way we do everything. I don't have to explain to people what the 5 ways of working are. It's integral in everything we do. One of the ways that we achieved that was actually by taking our unit, once we got to a certain level of learning, and sort of sending that expertise out into services. So sometimes you can, by harnessing, making it somebody's exclusive job, takes that responsibility away from other services, and it makes it something that happens elsewhere, you know, whereas we're looking at embedding this within the council, making it just the way we roll as a council, the way we do business, you know, where co-production is appropriate and useful and adds to the process, because it's one tool within an entire involvement spectrum of tools.
Because I suppose then, if you've got officers involved, then they've got the technical know-how and maybe the knowledge, and then that becomes a vested interest, doesn't it?
A specific officer, like a paid officer, you mean?
Any officers then, it's like social services, they, you know, if because you need that technical guidance and maybe officer led, that could then become a vested interest, couldn't it?
Right.
Much the same as someone coming in from outside.
Right. I think the idea is that we develop the confidence and the ability of officers so that we're then able to take our expertise in the area that we're employed to work and use the co-production knowledge that we have in order to support our citizens engage on their end with co-production. So quite sometimes, you know, we have the community wants to engage, but our officers sometimes aren't tooled up to meet them halfway. So it's, you know,
like
about looking at both sides.
Like planning officers. Yeah, it's just that stuff I've read. It says that there's, you know, there's benefits to having officers involved, but there's also can be some detriments. Because obviously the idea, of what I understand of co-production, is to get some of these community groups doing things for themselves. So of course there's a knowledge base that you have to share.
Yeah, absolutely. I think where this particular project is looking at is in terms of corporate co-production. So how we can co-produce more effectively and more widely as an organisation. So at the moment, most co-production activity takes place within social services.
Yes.
That's partly because of the nature of what social services do. They do a lot of work which is direct with service users, where people see that end result, where they have a direct interest. Yeah, people-based by definition, absolutely. What we're realizing is that actually there is real scope. Lots of areas have that interest to the public. So, for example, in parks or in recycling, or there are huge amounts of huge areas of the council where the scope to co-produce more solutions exist, where currently it perhaps isn't in the tool bag of things which would come to mind, the way that it is perhaps in social services, where the Social Services and Wellbeing Act really sort of energised and lit that fire, to really help co-production take off. So what this project's aiming to do is to take the good practice and to say, OK, this is where we know co-production will work. We know how officers used what the council has at its disposal in terms of resources, where it was done effectively, and we want to turn that into a policy so that where other areas and opportunities exist across all our services, where it's appropriate, we're able to sort of build on, that learning already that sits within our organisation, and really apply that and run with it across the organisation. CoPro Wales are pulling together examples of good practice, things which work, things which don't work, very much in the way that you have across Wales. But I think it's a very specific ask in an organisation like, in a local authority to, for example, in the health board, because we are a democratic organisation. So one of those areas for consideration, talks about how co-production complements representative democracy, because ultimately in a council, we take things through our cabinet or our council. So democratically elected representatives like yourselves set the direction and officers put it in place. And it's which areas are we able to turn over for the community, for citizens, for officers to work with. What's the envelope that we can co-produce within, and where can co-production, where is it relevant and where isn't it? Because there are areas where there's statute, there's requirements, there's budgetary considerations where co-production isn't appropriate, and there are other areas where there is absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be co-producing, and where it would make absolute sense. And at the moment, no local authority is doing that. So that's really the challenge that this project's trying to get to grips with, and it's something that you may have views on.
Well, I was going to say, I suppose I've seen one area in my lifetime of co-production, but they didn't call it co-production, and that's recycling. We now get the residents to recycle all our waste, and of course we don't need to employ people to separate it now, which because we do that, don't we? And I suppose that's an element of co-production. That's what we would call now today co-production, isn't it?
Is that right, Mike? Would you say? I mean, I'd say it's a win regardless. If that's co-production, I'd accept that and take it, I think. So
it's increased fly tipping.
If I may,
we've certainly got outcomes which are, objectively, economically, financially, environmentally, positive as a result of that, engaging our citizens in recycling. And it is actually a good, as it's a good example of something where we can't do it as a council alone. We do need people on board, and co-production is a way of making sure that we do it in the ways which, okay, aren't perfect, but which make sense for people to use, so that we don't do things like issue them with, oh, I don't know, wheelie bins that disappear down hills in Swansea because we're hilly, for example, you know. So it actually is a pretty good example to some extent.
Oh, I think it would be called co-production now, wouldn't it? But it's the pitfalls with it as well, and I'm not sure. I mean, it was purely financial. That was, you know, whatever ethereal reasons given, it's usually driven by finance.
It's certainly on that spectrum at the start of the report. It's certainly on that spectrum. I wouldn't consider that full co-production, I think, Mike. But it's certainly on that involvement spectrum, and it shows the benefits of involving our citizens and enabling people to use the assets that they have within them and within our community. So we're working with, rather than, you know, trying to take our citizens with us. So recycling, I think in terms of the formal definitions, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not really co-production as such, because you're not sharing power completely, and it's not completely from start to finish developed on a completely collaborative basis, but it's getting there, and it's adding value, and it's in the appropriate place.
Yeah, if I can just comment to that, if I may, I think it makes for a very interesting case study. In one sense, you could say, yes, this is co-production, because we have our service provider, the authority, and our service users, our citizens, working together with a shared goal, the goal of improving the service, improving levels of recycling. And in Wales, we excel in that area, and it's something we should be proud of. In another sense, a counter argument, you may say, is we did not do that with our citizens, we did it to them. We implemented this policy, and people who don't comply with the policy are fined. However, I would say that we have done some real world projects in the past 12 months in parts of Wales with communities who have struggled to comply with recycling obligations because information hasn't been accessible to them or understandable to them. We've worked with organisations who support people with learning difficulties, for example, to work with their service providers, with their local authorities, to understand how information can be better presented, how ways of recycling can be better communicated, how people can work with each other, sharing outcomes with shared goals. So yes, I think it makes for an interesting case study. I think you could make a case for it being co-production and against it being co-production, but the real markers of co-production, in the sense we're talking about it today, are not service providers imposing responsibilities on communities. They're not communities taking action without the permission of their service providers. They're people who provide services and people who use services coming together, sharing power and sharing responsibility to design and deliver better services which move to long-term preventative models which empower people, bring communities forward, bring more voices to the table, and ultimately, as has been said, will deliver long-term efficiency savings through optimised and improved service quality. So a very interesting example, no definitive answer, but a good one to unpack what co-production really means.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Joe. Francesca, you're indicating to come
Thank
in?
you, Chair. Really more as an indicator, really, an observation. And to thank Mike and Susie, I actually found it really interesting. I'm a big supporter of co-production in a voluntary organisation that I'm in. It's a big part of what we do, and obviously I think if it's done correctly, it can be really effective. And as Joe points out earlier, yes, there can be financial, not gains, but it can work out financially beneficial for the council perhaps. But I think what's really important is that people's voices are heard. And I know from my own experiences that if people, wherever they come from, doesn't matter what groups, if we can engage, and a councillor's role, I think, is really important in this, because we can sort of tap into those networks that we've got and built up. If people's voices are heard and listened to, then they get on board so much better. They invest in whatever we're trying to achieve, in whether that's that service or we're talking about recycling. If they feel that they are being listened to, as I say, they are more likely to sort of work with the council instead of that, being told. So I think it's really important, and I think it's a really interesting stages that we're going through, and I look forward to seeing how it develops over the coming months. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Francesca. Just one quick one for you, Susie. It's with regard to the champions again, and it's about release. How we release these individuals or these volunteers to gain the skill and the confidence to take this project forward. So they're all volunteers within the organisation. Do we foresee any issues with the release, or are we all on board to really push these volunteers forward and give them the skill they need to deliver this?
Absolutely, and that's the work really that's being taken forward at the moment. We're learning from the experience of other networks which have been used to support different agendas and mechanisms in the council. We're also looking to co-produce that, if you like, by engaging. We've already been to leadership team. We're looking to engage further now at senior management team and DMT levels, at cabinet and CMT, so that you get that buy-in from the bottom. We've sort of gone across the bottom, for want of a better word, of the organisation with officers, and that's where people have sort of come forward for this initial champion role, and we'll be we've obviously engaged right at the top to get this funding in place and to engage CoPro Wales, but it's really about getting that buy-in, and I think CoPro Wales refer to it as making waves throughout the organisation and getting the buy-in and the resource behind those waves, so that champions have the backing of their managers, and also so that heads of service are actively looking to say, okay, have we got that representation in our service? Because they can't afford not to these days. We can't afford to do things the way we've always done them. Times are changing, so yeah, it's about effectiveness and making the most of what we've got, rather than looking at new things for new things' sake. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. There are no more indications to speak. No. Take this opportunity to thank you and Mike firstly, and I think the feel is very much we're on board. We want this as much as you do, and obviously the opportunity to work with you is greatly received here on this committee, because a few members are not here today, and co-production seems to be the life at the minute, so I'm sure the contribution will be quite vast. But you're more than welcome to come again. I would expect you to come again. Thank you, Susie and Mike. But maybe a couple of workshops, might develop our skill and our knowledge as we move forward with you. So thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And thank you, Mike, for your time. You're more than welcome to come along anytime. Thank you.
Really appreciated, and really grateful for the offer of support from the group, and equally happy to come and discuss and support the group in its work as often as you want us to, in any form that feels most helpful.
Thank you, Mike. Right, thank you, Susie. And then we'll move on to agenda item 5, which is our work plan. Find it now.
Electing policy on the 20th.
Thank you. 28th of March, we've scheduled in the lighting policy. And 25th of April, we've got nothing to date, but we've got customer contact, which will be scheduled 23-24. And Swansea as the first human rights city needs to be scheduled as well. I think the co-production needs to be revisited, I would say quarterly at least, to see how we develop. So lighting policy 28th of March. And we'll try and arrange some workshops on co-production if that's okay with Susie. Anything else from anyone? No. So next meeting will be 20th of March at 1400, and I'll see you there if I don't see you before. Take care, look after yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you.